Say hello, John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, May 5th, 2020. It is Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Awareness Day, so we'll be discussing that today. So let me get to it. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We kind of break the rules here for Native Radio. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches, and we don't do spirituality shows. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity, and we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives, and we will provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us, and we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind people that our audio streams live on our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. We stream live video of the show on Facebook via Facebook Live on our Facebook group pages and across a bunch of other Facebook group pages as well. We take the audio and we put it up on SoundCloud, which puts it out as a podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms. We take the video and we put it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. And since I brought up Let's Talk Native TV and our YouTube channel, I do encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And in particular, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later on in the show as well. We just posted our brand new video on Canada. It's called This is Canada. And I not only encourage you to take a look at it, by all means, offer your comments, post it, share it on Facebook with your comments, and let this be, again, one of those projects that we do that furders a conversation. And you'll see why when you watch the video, the points that I'm trying to make there. So it's some very good work. My partner here, Jake Proud, has done a good job pulling in some video clips from a bunch of places, and just watch the video, and I look forward to hearing your comments. Again, join our Facebook or our YouTube channel. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, and subscribe to our podcast. You can, whatever platform you're used to using, go ahead and look for Let's Talk Native with John Kane podcast, and catch the shows that we do here. I am the show's host and producer, and I am joined here in studio by Jake Proud, who is managing our audio and our video. Like I said, it is, they said national. I prefer international, because when you say national, whose nation are you talking about? It's international. It's Global Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Day, Awareness Day, and we're going to talk about that. First, let me run through a few COVID-19 numbers, as I have been doing. The world will be at 4 million confirmed cases by the time we do our next show, by the end of the week. And that's not a wild estimate. That's going to be, they're almost there. By tomorrow, they're going to, be only, they'll be nipping at the heels, put it that way. The UK just passed Italy for the number of confirmed COVID deaths. And I think that might have been just today as well. And right now they only trail the United States in the total number of deaths by COVID-19. The U.S. blew past 70,000 deaths today. They're over 72,000 already, which was one of the predictions that target they keep moving after they blow through another prediction on how many total deaths there would be. Well, now there's a whole different set of models, and even the most conservative of them are saying that number, 70,000, could and should double by August. And and that's a lot of that's the current trend. And it is factoring a little bit into the fact that some of the regulations and restrictions are starting to loosen up on social interaction. But look, it's been averaging around 2,000 deaths a day, and they're expecting it to tick up to closer to 3,000 deaths per day by July and August. So I guess we'll see. Now, I also want to remind people, when you're hearing these numbers, and know that most of the numbers are coming from testing. And the United States, at this point, still has only tested 2.3% of their population. Even in New York, which is, been the, ground zero for COVID-19 in the United States, New York has still only tested 5.2% of the population. So if you're wondering how big can these numbers really go, well, the antibody testing gives you more of a extrapolatable, I guess, if that's a word, set of numbers to determine what the spread really is. The only way you can confirm whether somebody has it is with a test, but you can, by an antibody test, determine who has had it. And, it's going to be interesting to find out. Look, as we look at these numbers, and as I always say, I'm pulling these numbers off of websites that are almost entirely based initially on confirmed by test data. Now, when somebody dies and they think it is reasonable based on the symptoms and all of those other things to determine that the cause of death was COVID-19, then they add those numbers to the deaths and those numbers to the cases. But for the most part, most of the numbers are only coming globally are confirmed by tests. So those are kind of the numbers. We'll see what happens by the time we do our next show. Where the numbers lie, internationally, and what the trending is. Today was kind of an uptick in the number of deaths per day in the United States. As I've mentioned on previous shows, the UK is climbing the charts, but also Russia. Russia will be. I think they'll cross over to the 100,000 mark by tomorrow, I think. And these are how the numbers are just really growing. So all right, let me get on to what I intended to talk about today, which is missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I want to be clear here. When I say missing and murdered Indigenous women, I do mean girls, and actually I want to include even young boys. And of course, there's gay, bisexual, transgender, two-spirit. There's a lot of other Native people who are targeted for the kinds of abuse that result in this missing and murdered Indigenous people. We concentrate on women because it has been, and part of it goes back through history, and I want to talk about some of that history. So let me kind of get started. First off, let me be clear here. When we talk about things like a global pandemic, and there's all this effort to figure out, well, how did it start? Where does it come from? One of the things that Native people experienced in the Western Hemisphere was also were these contagious diseases, but it wasn't influenza, it wasn't the flu, it wasn't smallpox, it wasn't a lot of the diseases that you hear about. Even when you do write, you read in history some of the stuff. The first wave of pandemic disease that struck our people were sexually transmitted diseases. And again, to be clear, they were transmitted by sex. And in the case of colonists coming from Europe, and that's where it started, it was rape. It's the rape culture of Europe that not only, and I'm not even just saying that it affected the Native people on this continent. I mean, every place that European explorers went to, Captain Cook used to write, he wrote in his journal, when he approached, and came upon Hawaii for the first time, he noted in his journals that there would be a likelihood of so many people that would die because of if his men were allowed to go ashore. And obviously, if he wrote about that, he wrote about it because he had witnessed it already. So every place that these Europeans had gone. So get it out of your mind that that these brave explorers were like spreading Christendom, and that they were holy men, or they were pious, or they were representing the church. Yeah, they were representing the church. Kind of like representing organized crime. I mean, this is what they were doing, and they knew the first thing that that their men were going to do when they found a new place, especially if there were people there, they were going to rape the women, and that is what happened. And so the first wave of death that usually befell an indigenous population who was unfamiliar with Europeans usually came at the hands of rape and venereal disease. And the Europeans knew it. Again, Captain Cook, he knew it. He wrote about it in his journal. He knew that his men were carrying these diseases, and that anytime they came upon a new population, that there was going to be a certain level of death left in the wake of his men getting their rocks off. So, when you talk about missing and murdered indigenous women, you have to start at the beginning here, and that's where it begins. And of course, with all of this, you end up having this strange sexualization of Native women, and it still exists today. I mean, look, people have these fantasies about these island girls and all this stuff. Every time people think about the tropics and the Caribbean and that kind of stuff. What Disney did with by over sexualizing Pocahontas for their cartoon, which is not in the least bit historically accurate, but it creates this image of this beautiful Native woman with her, lots of flesh showing, being, and again, being seduced and ravaged by a big white guy. Well, that becomes part of the culture. And I think it's important that people realize where this stuff comes from. And of course, it isn't just the idea of sexualization. There's racism that plays into this thing as well. This whole idea of superiority, and of course, this is misogyny, that is exacerbated by racism, because you have this idea that white males, are the dominant species, and that's how they represented themselves and carried themselves, and how they treated other people was a reflection on how they viewed themselves. So when you talk about missing and murdered indigenous women and girls, that it has this really ugly history that goes back to the 15th century, and so any hope that somehow, well, eventually the cultures kind of come together, become a melting pot, and we all love each other, and there's this diversity that's respected, bullshit. That's not the way it happens. When you build a relationship on a foundation of hate, or white supremacy, or racism, misogyny. Look, if you look in the United States, white women still get paid less than white men. I mean, women in general are still beneath white men, and there's no question about that. And of course, women in general are often preyed upon by men, and not just white men either. So there's this whole gender thing, and this whole idea that males and the male dominant culture that exists, in many cultures, is one that treats women as property, as objects. As objects for male pleasure, and that's it. And that's why the value of the women in terms of as people, or even as lives, becomes compromised. And of course, when you look at this and you overlay this gender inequivalence with racial inequality, you find that women of color are in the most vulnerable positions. And of course, when you talk about a marginalized women of color, which Native people represent that more than anybody, we don't have a big population. And the populations that we do have are in very remote areas. So if a Native woman turns up missing, yeah, well, so. And that's the attitude that has been taken. And not just by, the non-Native population, but by law enforcement, by the judiciary, by politicians. I mean, there are so many women that when they turn up missing, and even if a large segment of them are runaways that are trying to escape the poverty that has been imposed upon them by U.S. or Canadian policy, even if it's that, because it may be that, it gets written off, and dismissed out of hand right off the bat by law enforcement and elected officials. And then if a woman turns up deceased, the first thing that they try to do is concoct a way to interpret that as an accidental death, and death by exposure. Just this past winter, there was a woman that was missing, and they said, well, they found her. She was frozen to death. No foul play expected. Well, how does a woman end up in the middle of nowhere and say there's no foul play involved? I mean, or they'll try to write it off as suicide. And I'm not suggesting that suicides don't exist on our territories. That's another one of those categories that we lead in. But I would say that part of the reason we lead in some of the categories is because, a suicide is a nice way to wrap up an investigation from an outside agency. As long as they can write something up as a suicide, they don't have to investigate. They don't have to find a culprit. They don't have to find anybody, a suspect, or they don't have to seek any kind of indictment. They can just say, well, it was a suicide. And there was a rash of them for a while where women were found struck by trains, and they said, oh, it was suicide by train. Well, it also became a very convenient way to dispose of somebody. So I think it's really important that people understand what's at play here when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women. This isn't just a cry for equality. We're not even at that place. We're saying this is a call out and a demand for justice, for victims. So I think it's really important that people understand that they understand that there is a real problem, and part of that problem isn't just because of apathy. There's a problem of complicity, especially with police. There have been stories after stories, and there's been investigations, although not nearly enough of them, where police forces, whether they're provincial police forces or the RCMP, or on the U.S. side, same thing, where there's been police forces that have been, part of the problem, either contributing to some of the misogyny, whether it's through conversation or creating this culture of sexualizing women and sexual assault. So, part of this day is to, one, pay respect to the women who have been murdered, and to really concentrate on those that are still considered missing. And regardless, because like I said, whether a woman leaves their home or their home territory because they're trying to escape poverty or the conditions that have been created, for these adverse conditions that so many Native people live under, then that's an issue too. And that has to be addressed. One of the things that I've talked about on previous shows when we've talked about this subject is, look, we have a problem with the outside, but we also have a problem internally. I mean, one of the things, that oftentimes gets mentioned is that 70% of the violence committed against Native women is violence committed by non-Native men. And, and of course, some of these are relationships that go bad, and some of them are where there's a known suspect or assailant, and some that are unknown. The man camps come to mind, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after a bit. But a lot of these are people that we've allowed to come into our territories, and we've looked the other way, and we've looked the other way on people who are on the sex offenders list, and of course we also become powerless to prosecute non-Native people on our territories. So there's almost like, there's laws against doing these things to women in general, but certainly to Native women. But if there's no law enforcement to prosecute or investigate, then it becomes, this crime that that goes unpunished. Now, the other thing, what I was alluding to here, is there's also our own. If 70% of the men who commit these crimes against women are non-Native, that means 30% are Native. So we have some of these people in our own territories. Recently on Facebook and a few other places, I'm seeing men who have been who abused women, who will actually sign up and start being part of the trying to capitalize on the missing and murdered Indigenous women movement. and they want to make it sound like they're champions for these causes, when it's some of these guys are the ones who have brutalized women. I mean, even one of the actors that was on was it Iron Horse, that film, Iron Horse. One of the actors in Iron Horse was outed as a woman abuser. Not the lead actor, but one of the actors, and that became a big topic right across social media. But I'm also seeing people involved in the cause for missing and murdered Indigenous women being men who are being called out, who are trying to capitalize on these things because maybe they use it to advance themselves as activists, when they themselves are some of the very guys who are involved with abusing women. Now, I realize there's a line between abusing a woman and a woman who turns up missing or murdered, but but those lines are connected. So we have to do more to hold our own people accountable. And I mean hold men accountable. We also need to, and I've talked about this on previous shows, we need to give our young people hope. We need to know, we need to understand that if you continue to perpetuate an environment where the only pathway that anybody can see, male or female, for happiness or for a better quality of life is to leave your territory, then you've got the doors wide open for everybody, for people to just leave, and oftentimes leave without telling anybody. So that kind of just overloads the system, if there really was a system, for us to determine, well, who's the victim and of foul play, and who's just leaving the territory because the territories are no longer they're being a person is no longer deeming it as a safe place to live. So how do we improve our territories enough? How do we create the opportunities? When you look at some of the films that have been done, or if you travel around, you go to some native territories, you think, when you ask yourself, why do these women put themselves in these positions? So you get into a little bit of victim shaming. And there's a reason, is because the position that they're already in, that doesn't involve them trying to leave their territory or find some means, outside of, what people would think of as a healthy lifestyle. I mean, look, there are people that are trying to find reasons to live day to day. They're trying to find happiness. And sometimes they will replace the idea of being happy with just feeling good. And this is where substance abuse and risky behavior comes in. Look, there's always a downside to making choices that could endanger yourself. But at the time when you're doing it, you're not thinking about the consequences. You're thinking about the way you feel at that moment. Look, we do lead in a lot of the categories that people just don't want to be the leaders of. We lead the categories for substance abuse and for suicide, teen pregnancies, depression. And again, our women are victims at the highest rate of any other people in this hemisphere. Our women, Native women, have the highest percentage of sexual assault and domestic violence than anybody. And that's unacceptable. And so when we address this thing, I'm not blaming the women for these crimes. I'm saying that all of us as communities, we need to do more to create a healthier and more wholesome life for our kids. Because it's like anything else I've talked about. I've talked about drugs, and I've talked about other unhealthy lifestyles. We don't come out of the womb with these bad habits. We often, and as children, we usually we're kind of all and many of us are in the same place. But at some point, we get closer and closer to making a decision that goes down a path that almost makes us irretrievable. So we get on that precipice where the next step might be a drug addiction. That next step might be prostitution. That next step might be doing something that's just going to cause bad health or danger. So whether we're thrill seeking or happiness seeking or, pursuit of happiness, if you want to call it that, or whether we're just so burnt out with the lives that we have. We all have a responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. There's no one person to blame. And certainly the victim's not to blame. Oftentimes, when I look at some of the, young people who you just have to wonder, what are their prospects for the future? And if you're wondering what that is for a young man, the prospects for a young woman are oftentimes even more bleak. Again, because of the way they're going to be treated, not only in Native society, but in the non-Native society. The idea of the commodification of our people, of our women. And again, it's supported by the sexualization of our women and everything from cartoons to Hollywood to music to, all of it. We see it over and over again. Look, it's nice when we talk about the idea of, reverence that we have towards women, and we tell we give the stories about, what our culture was. And we talk about it as if it's always past tense. And we don't talk about how it broke down. How did we become negatively influenced by the male-dominant culture from the outside? And we did. I mean, anytime you hear somebody refer to a chief system, especially among the Haudenosaunee, if you're referring to a traditional way of governing as a chief system, then you've already been indoctrinated with male dominance. Because we didn't have a chief system. We had a clan system where women played a very strong role. I'm not saying they ran it, but you had clan mothers, or a word that translates to clan mothers. Or at least that's what we use. But we had women who were responsible for titles within a family, and they had certain responsibilities. Not so much authority, but responsibilities. But we oftentimes talk about chiefs and the authority of chiefs and the chiefs. We didn't have a chief system. And the fact that it even gets referred to that, well, let me take that back. A chief system wasn't our culture. I will say that we did have, and in many cases we still do have a chief system. But that is a bastardizing of our culture. That is a corruption of our culture. Because that's not what Guyana or Goa was. And I don't, I can't speak for all Native territories, but I don't know how many places, put a man in a supreme position of authority and without having any accountability to women. I know that was the European model, and that's what swept over our territories. All right, hey, it's the bottom of the hour. I'll take a break and we'll come back. We're going to go through some more history, and we're going to talk about where this culture, not just rape culture, but this abuse of women culture, how it came all through the system, and especially with our children. We'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We are talking about Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Awareness Day. But let me give a shout out to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses and the folks at Grand River Enterprises and Native Wholesale Supply for supporting the show and doing it on a weekly or monthly basis and enabling us to do what we do. Among the things that we do is this show. Obviously, we do this show twice a week. We do a show for New York once a week. So we do 3 shows a week. But Jake and I also work on some short form videos. And we've got a new one that just dropped today. And it's called This is Canada. I want to encourage people. We should have brought the images, stuck it up on the screen behind us, but we'll promote it on the next show as well. But This Is Canada is a look at the racism in Canada, and one of the things that I mentioned in the film is when I started seeing people saying things like, if Donald Trump wins, I'm moving to Canada. If he wins re-election, I'm moving to Canada. I'm thinking, why? You think Canada's nice? I mean, are you buying into that BS? I mean, we have experienced some of the worst racism. In fact, I'm willing to say that I've experienced more racism on the Canadian side than I have on the U.S. side. And it's not because I haven't experienced some here. And certainly we have. And, my kids have. I mean, we've experienced it. But the only time I was ever refused service in a restaurant was in Ontario. So, look, I know what the racism is like, and so that's what the gist of the film is. We go right back to 1990, and we talk about the most egregious examples of blatant race riots that were waged against Native people, where not a single white person was ever arrested for stoning cars and smashing windows, and even one guy even had a heart attack as a result of being vandalized trying to escape a race riot. And of course it goes right up until we go through the 90s, and then a couple of years ago, and even today, the what we experienced with the protests associated with Sowetan, and frankly even some of the stuff we're still experiencing, even with COVID-19. Look, I've talked about it on the show here. We've experienced people saying, well, they ought to just let the disease go on to native territory and let it spread and wipe them out. Look, there's literally people who have said this stuff online. So the other thing that when I hear people say that about whether Trump wins the next election, I got into a conversation with somebody once, and they said, well, at least, we don't get gassed and, concussion grenades or run over at the protests in Canada. I'm thinking, yeah, you do. That's happened. And you're just not recalling it all. And besides that, all of that pepper spray and concussion grenades and the sound cannons and attack dogs, that was during the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. So it's like, where are you guys getting confused over this? And I'm not advocating for Donald Trump by any means, but so when I hear people think, well, the alternative to living in a Trump America is to live in a racist Canada. So by all means, please check out the video. It's on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. You just search "This Is Canada." I'm sure it'll show up. I've got it plastered across Facebook and Twitter, and we've got it on Instagram. So you can find the image. And by all means, please do check out the video, share the video, and offer your comments. I mean, look, if you think one of the things we didn't do in talking about the racism in Canada was actually breach into that the missing and murdered Indigenous women topic. So I guess if we get one criticism could be leveled, because I think missing and murdered Indigenous women is a racism issue, but it's first and foremost just this white, I guess that's racism, male dominance thing. And so there's room for that, and we will be doing more on these subjects. So, but by all means, check out this video. These are like 10-minute videos. Some of our short form videos are from 5 to 10 minutes. Yeah, maybe a little bit longer than that. But this one, you don't have to sit through a whole hour. So by all means, check it out. Share it with your friends and relatives. Maybe even share it with some of the people who have said some of these things, that we talk about in the video. So anyway, check it out. This is Canada. It's our latest video on Let's Talk Native TV, which is our YouTube channel. Check it out, and like I said, share it. All right, I wanted to go through a little bit of this list of, how policies have contributed to, and I guess they still will. I'll do it historically. I mean, because residential schools. It was, again, a fertile breeding ground for abuse of children. And although it was male children who were sexually abused, and women that are girls, that were sexually abused, it just creates that environment. I mean, I've argued, and I would love to see somebody kind of do an investigation in this thing. I think some of the clergy sex abuse stuff really found, got its footing and its foundation through the residential school era. Now, look, I know that the churches have been involved in sex abuse forever, and it goes back to, to Rome and the Vatican and, the Catholic Church, all of that stuff. But in terms of the clergy sex abuse, and especially where it wasn't even just the priests or the male clergy, but even the nuns and the women involved in the church. Yeah, it's the residential schools just contributed that. And keep in mind, these residential schools existed for over 100 years, and they had full access to children with no oversight. The federal government never, state, provincial, federal governments, they never, did any, oversight over these things, over these places. They got to do whatever they wanted to do with these children, and they did. So residential schools, and of course, the residential schools turns into, or devolves or evolves into foster care. We talk about the 60 Scoop and, all the children who, both on the U.S. and Canadian side, even kids being crossed over that U.S. Canadian border, kids that were taken out of native homes and put into non-native homes, and oftentimes the kids were abused in those homes, in these foster care systems, sexually abused. And even as for foster care leads into adoption, there was a lot of the amount of abuse that Native children experience because of residential schools, foster care, and the adoptions it's incredible. It's just incredible. And this is where you continue to feed this system of abusing marginalized or in many ways defenseless people. And of course, it feeds the missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. But having said all that, I do one issue that has come into focus lately, and I almost didn't want to talk about this because it seems so silly in many ways. Land O'Lakes. Okay, Land O'Lakes is a company that makes butter, and I don't know, maybe they make other dairy products too. And their logo had a Native woman in the center of their logo. And Land O'Lakes, Minnesota is considered the land of 1,000 or, I don't know, 10,000 lakes or something like that. And so when they say Land of Lakes, they're talking about Minnesota. Now, Minnesota, the word is a Native word. I mean, it comes from our language. So the idea of associating Minnesota with a Native person, and that's what they decided. So they take that image of a Native woman and they use it, they appropriate it for marketing their products. Now, look, I'm against that anyway. So when Land O'Lakes decided they were going to, pull the Native woman off their butter packages, I was not heartbroken. But listening to white people just go on and on and on about this, the crazy part is, and this isn't just a meme on Facebook. Oh yeah, 5,000 missing and murdered Indigenous women, and nobody gives a rat's ass. But take a Native woman off your butter package, and all of a sudden that's the only woman you're concerned about turning up missing. Look, that's not just a meme on Facebook. That's the reality. Listening to these white people just rail and just complaining. Oh yeah, first they took Aunt Jemima, and they want to strip away Miss Buttersworth, and I mean, listening to these moronic white people, and it's always white people. They can't understand what is wrong with appropriating and oppressed people for marketing, whether it's the Washington football team, or the Cleveland baseball team, or naming all of your weaponry after Native, Apache helicopters, Tomahawk missiles. I mean, using all of that, this Native innuendo in your military talk. There's so much appropriation of Native imagery. Whether it's Donald Trump, trying to insult Elizabeth Warren by calling her Pocahontas. Look, it's all insulting to us. Putting this woman on your butter package. Look, I'm glad it's taken off. But when I listen to white people say, oh, yeah, those people, this is all just about being PC. They just took that up. We're losing parts of our history. And, and here's the crazy part. Land O'Lakes did not take the woman off the package because of us. They didn't all of a sudden get a conscience. They didn't all of a sudden yield to political correctness. No. Look, they decided to go in a direction with their packaging because they no longer wanted to promote Minnesota as a native territory. So you take the native image off of it. So now they're going to promote Land O'Lakes, Minnesota, as farm country. Oh, the good American farmer. Like old MacDonald is raising cows to make butter for Land O'Lakes. Look, this is agribusiness. This isn't the home farm. This isn't Ma and Pa and the kids out there milking the cows for Land O'Lakes. And any imagery like that. Look, it also isn't, whatever the name they gave the woman on the Land O'Lakes. It isn't her either. But all of this is just marketing. This has nothing to do with history. And no, white people, you aren't losing a piece of your history because Land O'Lakes took the native woman off their freaking butter package. And if you think you are losing something, then you're twisted. I mean, that is just the most selfish and self-righteous thing that somebody can insinuate. That they are losing something. Look, I even heard say, oh yeah, when I was a kid, we used to play cowboys and Indians. We used to be able to, it was fine to play the Indian or get my cap gun and have bows and arrows and shoot. But now we can't even do that. Bullshit. Kids are playing. Well, what's the game? Video game? We killing each other. I'm sorry. Huh? Call of Duty. What's the other one too? No, the most popular game, Fortnite. That's what. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm losing my mind here. Yeah, kids are playing games that are far worse than even Cowboys and Indians. But you know what? I'm glad they're not playing Cowboys and Indians because it puts us in that category as the ones to be killed. Now, I'm not saying there aren't Native people getting killed in these video games either. But don't tell me that you've lost that children have lost the right to play Cowboys and Indians and because of political correctness. Give me a freaking break. There's more stuff out there that perpetuate racism, violence, violence against women than ever before. So don't tell me the PC police have whitewashed everything. You're full of crap. That couldn't be farther from the truth. In fact, the very reason we still have missing and murdered Indigenous women and why the problem in many ways is getting worse is because there is no political correctness. White people get to do whatever the hell they want to do. They can storm a state capitol fully armed with semi-automatic weapons because they want to protest of having to stay home with their families during a pandemic. I mean, how freaking ridiculous is that? They can storm a state capitol armed to the teeth like a bunch of mercenaries. I guarantee, arm a bunch of black guys or a bunch of Native guys. And let us go to a protest. Hell, we show up with our kids at a protest, and we get pepper sprayed. We get attack dog sicked on us. I mean, for crying out loud. I mean, don't even try to paint yourself as the victims losing your sports mascots, losing your Land O'Lakes woman. Are you freaking kidding me? That is the most absurd thing. And again, to make it the ultimate insult is the fact that we do have missing and murdered Indigenous real women who have been disappeared by your culture, and you're worried about the cartoon on the front of your freaking butter package being disappeared. I mean, that is just not just white privilege. That is white supremacy at its finest. And you know what? I'll tell you, if you're Native and you took offense to the Land O'Lakes lady getting pulled off the package, then you have already been so indoctrinated and assimilated. You're the same ones. If you are more pissed off about that than women who turn up missing, then I'm sorry, we're taking your Indian card. I don't know what the hell to tell you. And if you're more offended about the Washington football team, being attacked for the slur that they call themselves, than you are what the experience that we have to go through every day. Like I said, I've experienced racism, in almost any time that I've gone into public. One of the guys, Greg Deal, who does a bunch of performance art. Even dressing up as a kind of a Hollywood type of native person, he can just walk through and get this feedback from people where they do all of the most outrageous stereotypical, the boo boo boo, all that stuff. They think that after they insult you, they can say, "Oh no, it's all right. I'm a Redskins fan." Really? And you think that that enables you to make some derogatory statement or use a racial slur? It's incredible what we experience today. And we see it every day in Hollywood. We still, look, I've talked about, the film Real Indians, REEL, Real Indians. I'm sorry, Real Indians. They actually show Bugs Bunny shooting through a fort, and he fires a bunch of shots, and then he takes out a pencil on the wall of fort and says, 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians, bang 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 bang, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little. Oh, wait a minute, that's a half-breed. And then it erases half of a mark. Bugs Bunny, a cartoon about killing native people. And one of the native people doesn't count because they're only half native. This is what kids have been exposed to their whole life. So when we're looked at a certain way, and when these kids grow up to being men, and they can look down at native people, and of course, you look at what some of the places like Winnipeg and other places where native people represent a large percentage of the homeless population. Why? Because our territories have been driven into such states of poverty because of U.S. and Canadian policies, which again contributes right back to the same missing and murdered Indigenous women issue. So, as much as I didn't want to talk about the Land O'Lakes thing, the more and more I read about this, and my friend Cindy sent me some stuff, but I've seen plenty. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more it just annoyed the crap out of me. Listening to people just go on and on and on about Land O'Lakes. Even somebody saying, "Oh yeah, I went to the store the other day and I bought the last package that had the woman on it because I'm not going to buy the package if it doesn't have the Indian." Jeez. I don't even know what to say about half of this stuff. Some of this stuff seems so absurd that predominantly white people could be pissed off, and then make all of these racist and conservative talking point jokes about political correctness. So if you're if you're an oppressed person, whether you're a black person or a brown person or a native person, whatever. If you're not white and you try to bring any issues up that perpetuate racism, the immediate response from white people is, "Oh yeah, you're just trying to be politically correct." Well, yeah, you know what, we are. You know why? Because we're trying to be socially correct, whether you want to call it political correctness or not. Missing and murdered Indigenous women is not an attempt at being politically correct. It's about calling out for justice. And for me, what I want to do with this issue is to call our own people out to do more. And I'm not calling our people out. I'm not victim shaming. I'm not calling out women. And I'm not even really calling out the men who I talked about earlier. That I'm saying as communities, look, if your son or your brother or your uncle is doing something, has a lifestyle that includes abusing a woman, and again, native or non-native, you have a responsibility to address that. And if your buddy, look, if you think, "Oh yeah, he's a good guy. Yeah, I know he doesn't do right by his woman, but he's still a good guy." No, he isn't. Now, can you try to do something to make him be more responsible? Can you accept some responsibility to lean on your friend? I say, "Well, he's only like that when he's drinking." Yeah, but what do you do with your friend? "Oh, we go drinking." Well, there you go. We all have a responsibility not only to our own behavior, but to a certain extent, the behavior of the people that we become complicit with. Because if you're willing to look the other way when you know somebody's abusing somebody, because he's your friend or your buddy or your brother or your relative, then you are approving of that behavior. You can tell everybody else how much you don't approve of it, but if you don't ever confront somebody, and some of this stuff is correctable. Look, if a guy does something bad to a woman, and nobody ever calls him out on it, and nobody ever shames him, if you still think it's perfectly fine, then you're giving your approval to that behavior. Look, I'm not willing to throw any of our people away. I don't want to throw away the victims, and I don't even want to necessarily throw away the perpetrators of this stuff, especially within our Native communities. I have no problem trying to hold people accountable. And look, do I have a different view of whether it's somebody who comes onto our territories and commits a crime against a woman? Yes, I do. But we have processes. We have the Guyana de Goa. We have a history of how we dole out restorative justice, how we correct a problem, how we resolve conflicts. One of the ways you do not resolve a conflict is by ignoring it. If you continue to ignore a problem, and that's what's happened. So when I hear white people get pissed off because we're calling out a problem, and you're saying, no, you should continue to ignore it. We're comfortable with racist mascots and sexualization of Native women. Just get over it. Yeah, we get told that. But if that's what you're going to put to us when we try to offer a correction, we're not stealing something from you. And look, you can watch every one of these conversations devolve that. Oh yeah, see, they're taking away parts of my history. They're taking away my upbringing, my childhood. Bullshit. I mean, it is really time that when that conversation begins, and shame on you white people who just sit back and let that stuff get rattled off of somebody's mouth without calling them out on it. Look, it is not enough to say you're not racist. Because here's the problem. If you're not an anti-racist, if you are not prepared to take a stand against racism, then it doesn't matter if you claim to be not to be racist. You're complicit in it. That's, we hear it over and over and over again. Silence is the biggest problem when it comes to confronting injustices. If you remain silent, there's a word for that. They call it acquiescence. Approval with your silence. So when somebody tells a racist joke and you just kind of struggle to laugh because you think that's what's expected of you, instead of saying, I don't get it, or that's not funny, and let the joke teller feel uncomfortable. Let the abuser be uncomfortable. Let the racist be uncomfortable. You shouldn't have to be the one who sits there in your uncomfortable silence because you had to endure that behavior. Turn the tables. And I say that to all of us. We need to take a stronger stand on injustice, on oppression, on violence, on bullying, on all of these things that lead to marginalizing a group of people who have the least amount of power to seek justice. That's what lies at the core of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And look, this is a day that we dedicate to raising awareness, but this is an issue that goes on every day. Every day I've got, the flag behind me, this missing and murdered Indigenous women, it's a flag that I designed to try to capture both the missing and the murdered women and promote the issue. Am I doing enough? No, I'm probably not, and I should do more. And every year I hope that I'm gonna, maybe get a bunch of these flags printed out and distributed and try to step up. But I'll tell you, we all need to do more. And we also need to make sure that the people who are carrying this message are true, and that we aren't letting people gain celebrity off the crisis or off of off of victims. And I see too much of that as well. So again, as we close out the show, I will say next week I do have or not next week, on Thursday, for my New York show, I've got Jolene Holgate, who's Danae, who's going to be joining Regan and I on Let's Talk on my WBI show. She works with missing and murdered Danae relatives, which include missing and murdered women and girls, Two-Spirit. So we're gonna talk, and we're gonna have Jolene join us on the show. So join us. That's on Thursday from 4 to 5. It's a 1-hour show this week. We are in fund drive mode. So so join us on WBI. We will be live streaming it here on Facebook, and of course we'll put it up as a podcast afterwards. So that's Regan with Jolene Holgate joining us on Thursday. Thanks for listening, and again, check out the video. This is Canada, and give me some feedback. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Nyawai.